Hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Let's Talk Mediterranean, the Mediterranean Seminar's occasional podcast. I'm Brian Catlos, and I'm here with Sharon Kinoshita. We are the co-directors of the Mediterranean Seminar, and our guest today is Paul Love, who is a faculty member in Humanities and Social Sciences at the Al Akhawain University in Ifrane, Morocco. His article, Provenance in the Aggregate, The Social Life of an Arabic Manuscript Collection in Naples, published 3 years ago in Manuscript Studies, is our April 2021 Article of the Month. Our board member, Daniel Gullo, who nominated the article, noted, Paul Love focuses on the question of provenance and the use of manuscripts at the collection level rather than on the individual manuscript level to help us understand the role of manuscript culture in North African and Mediterranean society. Perhaps due to the unremarkable content of the collection, Dr. Love teases out the importance of manuscripts for communities across space and time. His approach helps us understand the use of individual manuscripts in the context of a collection. We see the history of the owners and books unfold as the collection moved from one location and owner to another. His article provides a unique window into material culture and the power of social forces as much as individual reading interests in shaping a collection and its history over time. He reminds us of the importance of manuscript culture within Mediterranean communities and its continuation into the modern era long after the development of the printing press. So we're very glad to have you here, Paul. And with that, I'll pass the mic over to Sharon.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome, Paul. I wonder if you could start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, your institutional affiliations, and I got the impression that this article was not something that was really central to your research, but a kind of serendipitous find for you. So if you could tell us about the main focus of your work and interests, that would be great.
Sure thing. So first of all, thank you so much, Sharon and Brian, for the invitation to have this conversation. It's a real pleasure. And yes, it was definitely a series of coincidences that led ultimately to this. So first of all, I was doing this while I was still a graduate student. So my graduate training was in the United States at the University of Michigan in the Department of Near Eastern Studies. And I was working on a dissertation on the history of Ibadi Muslim communities, a non-Sunni, non-Shia Muslim community in North Africa during what's often referred to as the Middle Period, so from the 11th to the 16th centuries. And basically, my project was, or what I thought my project was going to be, was to go to as many libraries in the world as I could and find specific copies of these particular titles of Ibadi works from the late medieval period, and to reconstruct this corpus to try to have a sense of who copied these books and where did they move and things like that. And so I ended up a few years ago in Naples at an institution that's popularly called L'Orientale, so the Oriental Institute in Naples. And I was there to look at two manuscripts, which are part of the article ultimately, but I really wasn't there for the rest of them. So I showed up and I realized that since the 1940s, nobody had been very interested in this particular collection of manuscripts. And so I decided, mostly for my own purposes, to write a catalog. It wasn't a huge collection of manuscripts, it's only 11 different titles. And so I wrote this catalog and I began to notice many of the things that eventually came out in the form of the article in thinking about the long-term history of it. So that's sort of how it got started. I only wrote that, I should say, long after I finished it, in the sense that I did the fieldwork as a graduate student and then became a faculty member here at Al Akhawain after graduate school. And it's really as a result of being in conversations with my colleagues and also as my own work began to evolve that I began thinking about the questions in the article. In a more general way, what I work on is, it continues to be Ibadi history and Ibadi manuscript culture, but I'm interested in particular in the way that Ibadi books and more broadly the Arabic manuscript tradition in North Africa has a role to play in complementing our understanding of the history of societies and peoples in the region. And so I look at books, in particular Ibadi books, but more generally manuscript books, as actors in the social history of the Maghreb and the Mediterranean and the interrelationships between those two spaces and other spaces farther to the east, as well as down into the Sahara.
Well, that's great. The article is available free to download and read on our website, but perhaps you could just spend a very brief few moments telling us more specifically about this article in particular, what you cover and what you think its significance is.
Sure. So I think of this as a social biography of this Arabic manuscript collection in Naples. So again, it's a small collection of 11 manuscripts, almost all of which are Ibadi Muslim manuscripts produced in North Africa. But basically, the article is my attempt to take a bunch of disparate information from the history of this collection that I'm able to draw from the physical objects themselves and their histories and put them together into a kind of narrative. And the reason that I'm saying provenance in the aggregate in the title is because individually, I can't say much about these objects. The titles are kind of unremarkable in the sense they exist in a lot of different copies, both manuscript and print. But together, the argument is, together when you put all of these different sort of elements of the biography together, they produce an interesting social history that gives a different meaning to these small kinds of Arabic manuscript collections that you find throughout European and I mean really throughout the world in libraries like that in Naples.
And what sorts of insights, what sorts of special insights do we gain out of this this perspective?
Well, I think, you know, first and foremost, when you look at the long-term history of manuscript culture in the Mediterranean, you realize that it really is a story that clearly involves both the northern and southern edges of the Mediterranean, as well as, you know, taking it out in every other direction as well. But in this particular case, this is a collection that is mostly tied to what are today northwestern Libya and southern Tunisia and Italy, right? And of course, it makes sense looking at a map that those two would be interconnected. But what's great about these physical objects and looking at this as a collection over a long term is that the story moves back and forth between the two banks of the Mediterranean in this really beautiful way that is, I think, representative of Mediterranean history.
Great. Can you maybe give us a thumbnail sketch of the Ibadis, who they are, and what drew your interest to them?
Absolutely. So Ibadi Muslims, as I said before, the sort of most basic thing is that they're neither Sunni nor Shia Muslims. And so that's the sort of fun, interesting starting point of I think, many of us interested in the history of Ibadi Muslim communities. That's one of the things that draws us to the study. Geographically speaking, in the contemporary world, Ibadis are concentrated in very particular geographies. So here in North Africa, the Mzab Valley in sort of central Algeria, the island of Jerba in southern Tunisia, and the Jebel Nafusa in northwestern Libya. Historically, the community is much bigger than that. And even the contemporary community, and in fact, the largest concentration of Ibadis in the world is actually in the Arabian Peninsula in Oman, with important, I should say, important Ibadi communities, although much smaller in places like the East African coast, in particular the island of Zanzibar, but also contemporary Ibadi communities in and throughout Paris, the UK, Canada, and the United States. And I think that I initially got drawn to the study of Ibadis through coincidences. So I began the study of Arabic as an undergraduate student in Tunisia and had a chance to visit Jerba. And I was initially interested in this community when I learned about it. But then a series of different opportunities to study Arabic in other places lended itself to continuing to follow Ibadis. So I then traveled to Yemen and did a project on Ibadis in the Hadramaut, and then I had a chance to study in Oman. And so each time that I ended up getting somehow managed to get some funding to go somewhere to do something, it intersected with Ibadi history. And so by the time I got to graduate school, it made sense to do that.
Great. Can you say just a bit about when they emerge in history, or what's known about them and what makes them distinctive in relationship to Sunni and Shia?
Absolutely. So like most early identifiable Muslim communities, the story sort of gets started in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. And for Ibadis, that's really concentrated in the city of Basra, in what is today Iraq. And the community distinguishes itself early on from what are often referred to in Islamic history as Kharijite communities. And Kharijites have their own interesting story as a non-Sunni, non-Shia community. But in any case, contemporary Ibadis, although they recognize a shared affiliation with this early sectarian community of Kharijites, see themselves as quite distinct. And the thing that distinguishes them as one of the sort of famous things about Kharijites is the, maybe not the advocation for, but the willingness to use violence as a tool. And Ibadis quite early on distinguish themselves as what are often called quietist Kharijite community. So to sort of make it more simple, this community gets started, distinguishes itself as an identifiable religious community, not really distinguished in the sense of like law or theology at that point, right? More as a kind of communal identity. And then as it spreads out from Basra mostly through missionary activities and tribal connections to North Africa, to Oman, and to other places, it's then that it begins to develop as a separate kind of community. And in terms of what distinguishes them precisely from Sunnis and Shi'is, there's a different political theory of who should lead the community. So in theory, anybody should be able to lead the community, which is a unique feature. And then they do have their own eventually legal traditions, hadith traditions, and theological traditions. But honestly, whether historically or contemporarily, aside from an elite scholarly class, very few people would be able to articulate those kinds of differences. So I would say that the thing that distinguishes them is this kind of, this distinct communal history, as opposed to theology or law.
That's very helpful. Can you maybe pull out a couple of the like starter interesting things that you saw from this collection of manuscripts in Naples, and the kinds of paths, I don't want to call them rabbit holes, but you know, the different kinds of miscellaneous aspects of the biography of these objects that you were able to feed into this tableau of Ibadi diffusionism and manuscript collecting?
Absolutely. So one of the things that struck me in this collection, and continues to strike me about many North African manuscript collections, is that although the texts that we're talking about often are medieval texts from the 15th century backwards, let's say, the vast majority of extant manuscripts are from the 17th century forward. And I think that for me, that's really, really important, because not only does it speak to this long-term transmission of text over time, which is itself remarkable, but also to the real importance for the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries for the preservation, the material preservation of those texts. And then once I started thinking about that and bridged it with what so many people have written about in terms of the production of paper in places like Italy from the 17th century forward, I began to think about those as actually part of the same story. And that was one of the, I would agree with calling them rabbit holes, because some of them took a really long time to get out of, but they were interesting avenues certainly for me to follow. And that was one of the first ones that really struck me. So
just to spell it out a little bit, you found that many of these manuscripts used paper of Italian manufacture with watermarks that made the origins identifiable and so forth. So a fascinating history about the book as object.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, to anybody who works on North African manuscripts, and to some extent Eastern Mediterranean manuscripts in general, if you were to pick up the papers that you're working with, there's a really good chance that the watermark you're going to look at is Italian, if it's from the 17th century forward. But what I thought was cool about this particular collection was I knew that it came from northwestern Libya, and so I might actually be able to figure out how those papers got to the places where they became manuscripts. So that transition from paper produced in Italy to manuscript produced in North Africa was a line that, again, perhaps only in the aggregate, but in this case, I felt pretty confident with it. I could draw that line in a way that I found really fascinating.
So this collection is at the Orientale in Naples. And is this indicative of some particular interest on the part of Italian academics in Ibadism, or was this just part of a kind of a general sweep of a sort of colonized culture, or was there something in particular that interested scholars or colonial administrators or whoever was responsible for putting this together?
Yeah, so that was another of the initial things that sparked my interest in the collection. There was an article published in the 1940s by Italian Orientalist Roberto Rubinacci, and it's just a description really of the same collection that I was looking at least most of the same books. But he starts it with this paragraph, this wonderful paragraph that really quickly says these were taken, collected during 1912 and 1913 during the Italo-Turkic War, and then they were transferred to Naples. And they were found in the office of an Ottoman mutasarrif, or a prefect. And that by itself hides so many incredible things about the history, or this is part of the argument that I was making at least, was that I think this hides behind it so many really wonderful things about this exchange over the long term. But you're right that more precisely in the 20th century, there's a specific historical context for this, which is not at least at the beginning an Italian Orientalist interest in Ibadis, but it sort of turned out that way because the Italians invade the Ottoman province of Tripolitania and take control of it. And so it's part and parcel of the beginnings of the production of colonial knowledge in Italy about Islam. And so these manuscripts, and I should also say lithograph books, which I wasn't able to track down for a variety of reasons, but lithograph books and manuscripts were transferred from this Ottoman prefect's office to Naples. And the reason that they were transferred there was because they were first sent, as they were collected on the one hand by a journalist and the other by the army. They were put together, and then Francesco Beghino, a very well-known Berberologist in the world of Italian Orientalism, requests that they're sent to Naples. And so it's there that they end up, and that Rubinacci himself, connected to the history of the colonial effort of the Italian Empire, works on them. So there's this really interesting genealogy of that hidden in that little paragraph, which I thought was quite cool.
Wow. Well, my next question was going to be, can we see a colonial imprint on this collection in terms of selection and organization? And how does that enrich or distort our understanding of Ibadi history and culture? But I guess now I would ask if there's I guess it's kind of like a double colonization and mediation, right? First through the Ottomans and then through the Italians, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so it turned out that this prefect, whose office is referred to, he's not named, but it turns out that this prefect is a really well-known person. His name is Musa Bey Grada. And Musa Bey Grada is a really close friend of perhaps the most famous Ibadi, who is known as Suleiman Bash al-Baroni. And he's this sort of infamous figure in the early 20th century. In European archives, he shows up all over the place. But yes, he's very much connected to kind of a late Ottoman political history in North Africa. And so it turns out that the owner of this collection, or at least the owner of the office where this collection was held, is connected to Ottoman imperial history, European imperial history, and more precisely the Italian colonial context. So there's a lot of intersections there, yeah, of imperial histories in a single office of manuscript, which is quite cool.
And to continue that line, you had some very interesting things to say about what this particular collection reveals about Italian colonialism in North Africa, as opposed to French colonialism in North Africa, and then also how the particular contents of the manuscripts that were transferred to Italy then helped shape Italian Orientalism. So I wonder if you could follow some of that story, you know, between the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, so I have to say that I found it kind of poetic that of course the papers begin in Italy and then they move to the Jebel Nafusa and then they move back to Italy. So there's something sort of poetic in that. But yeah, the impact that they ultimately have. So, you know, the contrast that was in my mind when I was writing this was French Algeria and the colonial history of Algeria. And that's because I was working on a similar kind of idea for a separate piece on colonial knowledge production about Ibadis in the Mzab Valley in Algeria. And building on what a lot of people who know far more about it than I do have said, I was thinking about colonial knowledge production of Ibadis in French Algeria as something that is a much more carefully thought out plan and construction, and building upon, certainly by the late 19th century, decades of the colonial experience there. And I was really struck when because I'm not trained as a historian of colonialism, I was coming to this pretty recently. I was really struck by the contrast between that image of colonial knowledge production in the French context and the Italians, who really only begin to assemble their knowledge of Islam in this particular context of North Africa following the invasion. And so there is an active role for these manuscripts and other manuscripts that are acquired during the early years of the Italian colonial project in Tripoli to understand the peoples that they're trying to control. And there are a number of missteps that the Italians make in trying to do that. Sort of famously, one of the treaties that leads to their control of this area of Africa includes an acknowledgement for the role indirectly of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. So they sort of, from the very beginning, sabotage their own efforts to claim political control of the area. And at least other people have argued, my understanding of other people's arguments who work on Italian colonialism was that those things in a sort of general way come out of deficits in Italian understandings of Islam in a North African context. And so people like Rubinacci, when they use this collection and other collections of Ibadi texts, are trying to understand the legal systems of the people that the Italians are trying to control, and even the theological systems of the people that they're trying to control. And it's not always clear, you know, that line between this is going to be useful for the colonial project and what I'm writing about in, you know, an academic setting. That's not always a clear line. But one of the things that I learned from the French colonial scholarship was that the line is there. You just have to think about it sort of more expansively. I hope that answers your question. I feel like I went sort of all over the place there.
Well, if I could take it back to the collection itself, you mentioned that on the whole, you described it as unremarkable, but can you give us an idea of what, you know, some of the key works or genres that are represented there, and if you encountered any sort of, you mentioned that a lot of these works were, you know, fairly well known and you know, existed in many copies. Were there any, you know, hidden gems or unique items that you came across within that collection? But I'd like to hear more about it as a whole too.
Yeah, so in terms of genre, I would say that the majority of them pretty squarely fall into the world of jurisprudence, of fiqh. And that's not really surprising because the titles that I found were the kind of the core curriculum of Ibadi education. I was interested that they included mostly late medieval works, which again makes up the core curriculum, but also commentaries on them from a slightly later period. So I think that I wasn't particularly struck by any of the contents of the text in the sense of the main text. I think the thing that I was most struck by were paratexts, that is, things that are in the margins and things that you can learn about the text from those marginal notes in conversation with physical features. So I'll say sort of two examples of that. Physical features, I wasn't terribly surprised to find that there were Italian watermarks. What I was really delighted by were the beautiful bindings of a couple of them, in particular mixed media bindings of sort of printed cloth and leather. And those sorts of things are hard to sort of unpack and understand what precisely they represent, but it was a pleasant surprise. But in terms of marginal notes, I think that I was immediately struck by the connections that this particular collection made with the island of Jerba in Tunisia, rather than what I expected to find, which was a lot of evidence about its connection to northwestern Libya. And so that also allowed me to think more expansively about the history of the collection and to begin to draw some very specific connections between items in the collection in northwestern Libya and Tunisia, which itself overlaps with what I know about Ibadi history, which is that there is a long series of communication and a relationship between those two places.
That's very interesting. I wonder if you could tease out any consequences or further thoughts, future projects that might be coming out of this or building on similar kinds of serendipitous insights.
Yeah, definitely. So I've continued since 2018. I've been pretty involved in Jerba and the world of manuscript culture there through a series of digitization projects. And so what since 2017 we've been doing is digitizing private libraries with the support of the Arcadia Foundation's Endangered Archives program, which is administered by the British Library. And what that's allowed us to do is to take collections, including small collections like this one, still in situ in Jerba, and digitize them and present them to a much larger audience. And my hope is that in the aggregate, all of these small collections, it'll become clearer that all of these collections are actually very closely related. So to give you an example, the collection in Naples is connected to a family called the El-Ba'atour family. And the El-Ba'atour family is a Jerban family of Libyan descent. Their library is a really famous library in Jerba, but it burned down in the 1980s. And the Naples collection and other collections on Jerba have all of these marginal notes and random books that used to belong to this library that burned down. And in the aggregate, those sorts of data can allow you to reconstruct collections that no longer exist, which is exciting on the sort of micro level, but it gets even more exciting the bigger it gets. So that's one thing that I've continued to do, and we're actually in the process of doing that right now. And our hope is that in the very near future, we'll be launching a similar project in the Jebel Nafusa with colleagues in Libya. We're going to bring a group of people to Jerba to train them on how to photograph and document collections. And then hopefully through a very international effort across both sides of the Mediterranean, we're going to be working to digitize more collections like this.
Well, this is really marvelous because Daniel Gula, the colleague who nominated you, is head of the Malta Study Center at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. And as you may know, they're great project right now is digitizing collections around the world, and especially collections in danger. So the work that you're doing across North Africa with this Ibadi material is just dovetails beautifully. And I think Daniel will be extremely pleased and gratified to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. What a wonderful coincidence.
Well, our time is almost up, but I can't resist. I do want to just ask you one little question about Jerba, because Jerba just seems to be one of these quintessential Mediterranean places with with Ibadis there, with a very important Jewish community, and of course connections and periods of occupation by Normans, Aragonese, probably Angevins, Ottomans. How special is Jerba in this regard, or does it represent a sort of an example of the types of places and evidence we might find if we look elsewhere across North Africa?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. So I feel like I had this kind of myopic vision of what Jerba means, mostly because of my interest and attention to Ibadi history. But I have to say that it's one of the things that initially drew me to Jerba was that tremendous diversity and this sort of amazing network of connections throughout the Mediterranean world, whether we're talking about the Punic period or the Ottoman period. I mean, it's really remarkable. I think that, I mean, my impression is that you can certainly find analogous situations throughout the southern coast of the Mediterranean and North Africa. But yeah, there does seem to be something special about Jerba in the concentration of those kinds of stories. It's kind of like, I feel like I could take any coastal city in Northern Africa and find similar kinds of stories, but I would need to combine 2 or 3 of them to put together all the stories that I find in Jerba. And so it's one of the things that I really adore about it. I can also say that one of the things that came up in this article and that has since really been all of my time other than manuscript digitization in Jerba is the story of the Jerban diaspora community in Cairo and their connections throughout the whole of the Ottoman world. So there's this way in which Jerba's international flavor or trans-regional flavor is then transplanted to different places and sparks its own kinds of networks in really fascinating ways. So I've been interested in particular in a Jerban school and library and trade agency called the Buffalo Agency, the Wikaret al-Jamus, which operates for 400 years in Cairo and connects Cairo to Jerba in this really amazing way. So yes, absolutely, trans-regional Jerban history is my favorite thing about the place, aside from its wonderful manuscript collections and people, of course.
Yeah, it's such a curious place. It's got this kind of weird, languid feel to it. This sort of interesting combination, which is perhaps really Mediterranean, of a sort of, I guess you could call it a rural cosmopolitanism, because it's not really urban at all, but it's got this incredible mix of people from different places. And for me, that's one of the striking things about the Mediterranean as we look through history, that it's not only the cities, that so many historians have looked at and emphasized, that are the locales where we have this intense diversity and intercultural interrelations, but really across the whole countryside too, which for me, it gives it this depth that in some ways sets it apart from many other regions, in which at least the countryside tends to be a much more, at least from our point of view, homogeneous environment.
Yeah, I think a really striking example of that came up for us recently in one of these digitization projects was the El-Bessi Mosque. So this was originally an Ibadi mosque that had a cool manuscript collection, which is why we were interested in it. But its manuscript collection is founded by Jerban traders who were active in Istanbul from the El-Bessi family. And the connection with Istanbul and other parts of the Ottoman Empire only continues through a series of direct communications with Istanbul in the form of firmans, of royal or sultanic decrees. And it seems like it also randomly served as a garrison for an Ottoman force. And to your point, this is not, in the port, it's not even in the port of Jerba, it's in the middle of the island in this very, very rural setting. And yet here it is with this concentration of imperial items drawn from all over the empire and its library, and with these decrees from the Sultan. It's just an amazing Jerban story in that sense because of all of these connections. And so, yes, I agree 100%.
Well, this has been great, Paul. We've been really happy to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you. Your article is really fantastic, thought-provoking, and original. And we're looking forward to reading more of your work. So unless Sharon has anything else to add or to ask.
Just to add my thanks and how delighted I was to read your article.
Well, thank you so much to both of you again for the opportunity and for this conversation. It was a whole lot of fun.
Okay, well, thanks again to Paul Love for joining us for Let's Talk Mediterranean, and see you in a month.